Well, good morning. It's an honor to welcome all of you on behalf of the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas. We last met in 2019, and it's been a long time, so it's great to see a lot of your faces. And I'm looking forward to our panelists and our speakers today, and just our camaraderie and the ability to say hi to each other in person. I'm also looking forward to the lunch program, and I want to welcome all of you to the state conference this morning. As I mentioned, we're glad to be meeting again in person, and also want to welcome those who are joining us via live stream across the state. And so thank you for being here as well today. The nonprofit FOI Foundation of Texas has been a leader in promoting open government, transparency, and public information, and defending free speech in this state since our founding in 1978. And we've come a long way. We've been through many battles in courts of law and courts of public opinion and at the Capitol. And it's always a challenge to protect our liberties, and essential to that endeavor is knowing what the government is doing when they're tasked with protecting our rights. And so I want to just commend everyone for all their work they've done on those fronts. All of you rely on public information to inform the public, to project the importance of public information, and rely on public information in day-to-day and all your activities that you engage in, informing the public or advocating for transparency. I want to hand things over to Josh Hinkle of KXAN, who's our moderator of our first panel, and an important panel, law enforcement transparency. Where do we stand? So Josh, take it away.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm Josh Hinkle with KXAN TV, the NBC station here in Austin. I'm pleased to be moderating this panel today. It has been a packed year at the Capitol, a regular session and 3 special sessions, where many had hoped this topic would get a lot of focus after a time in our nation focused on policing and racial justice. Joining me today here in person is Eva Ruth Moravec, the Executive Director of the Texas Justice Initiative, which focuses on criminal justice data statewide. And joining us live by Zoom from the state capitol, closing out the first week of the 3rd special session this year under the dome, is Representative Joe Moody. I said state capitol, but you said you're somewhere else, right?
I'm in an undisclosed location.
All right.
I'm back home in Mountain Time, and I figured I'd try to get a little bit of home time before things got a little crazier there at the Capitol.
Understandable. Yes, Representative Moody is a Democrat from El Paso who co-chaired the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus in the House during the regular session. Welcome to both of you. I want to start with that caucus. Representative Moody, what was the thought behind it, and how would you measure its success in terms of transparency?
Yeah, I think we've gained a lot of traction on multiple issues. Transparency is one that I think we have. I don't want to color the conversation completely, but we took some step backs. We took some steps back this session compared to where we were before. Not to say that there aren't the same efforts and some major agreement on transparency and policing and otherwise, but you have some examples look at the example from TDCJ during an execution while we were in session, where the media just is inexplicably not allowed to be in the room, where they have been there every single time since we reinstated the death penalty, and the excuse from TDCJ was, oops. That's it. That's the only answer I got back. Myself and Jeff Leach, who co-chairs the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus, both of us incensed at the problem. So it's not that the group is stronger than ever. It is still a very bipartisan group. We've certainly seen some polarization throughout these summer months and the end of the regular session. But on the issue of criminal justice reform, there's still a good bipartisan coalition to work on these issues, but it seems like we've certainly hit a wall in terms of transparency issues. And that's something that, in the time of the pandemic, which layered in some more complicated problems for us, to me, it's more important than ever. And so hopefully we can drill down on that and further as we move along.
A lot of what that caucus focused on and was able to accomplish this past regular session was on police reform, but specifically, back to law enforcement transparency. What do you feel like the mood of the legislature is this session with that topic?
I think front and center, we had kind of competing lanes of conversation. You had those of us who wanted to focus on use of force, which I think also dovetails nicely into the conversation about transparency, because how do we know what's happening in these interactions if we don't have access to that information? We want to focus on things like no-knock warrants, like multiple provisions of what was called the George Floyd Act in response to his murder. And so there was a lane of that conversation. And then there was this kind of bristleback, and I'll call it, don't really like to buy into people's catchphrases, but people label back the blue. But I mean, it was more about funding of police. And where's, that actually begged another question about transparency. So if we're going to debate funding, we're going to debate, you got Prop A there in Austin right now, you're going to debate those things and the taxpayers on the hook. Where's the requisite amount of transparency to go along with that? If we're going to require people to put those dollars down as taxpayers, or we don't have a real good look and real good control over our levers of government, I mean, is that really a fair exchange? And so that, you really had kind of competing viewpoints, and we tried to put transparency measures on those funding bills, and we're unsuccessful at doing that. So it's certainly presented a more complex and challenging problem this session than it has in the past too.
Eva Ruth, same question to you. As a non-lawmaker, what were your thoughts on how the mood of the legislature was when it came to police transparency this past session?
I think, as Representative Moody said, hit a wall. I think, amid the COVID pandemic, trying to get data from the system about that, while this execution happened in the dark of night, it did feel like that tone had changed. I think, historically, Texas has been sort of known for this bipartisan place where criminal justice reform has magically happened. And there's been some stories reported on that in the past month or so about, is that effort all dead? I think the 2019 session was bad, but not this bad. This past session, it seemed like even the sort of low-hanging fruit that there had been in the past when it comes to data and just looking at numbers and enforcing things that were already on the books, that sort of thing I was expecting to at least be able to move this session, and not seeing that. I think there was just a lot of, just like we're seeing across the country, a lot of hostility and this very two-sided approach to criminal justice issues where, you're either in one camp or the other, and there isn't a lot of middle ground.
Both you and I testified before a House committee this past spring on a bill carried by Austin Representative Eddie Rodriguez that would have addressed late and incomplete reports filed by law enforcement agencies after someone dies in their custody. That bill failed to progress beyond the committee. What was the goal there?
This was one of those low-hanging fruits, as I saw, at least. So Texas has this law in the books for many years where we require reports to be filed when somebody dies in the custody of law enforcement. And as Josh has reported extensively, this bill was passed in 1983, and the goal of it really was to shed light on deaths in custody, to get at why these were taking place. The punishment, if you will, for not following the law and not filing a report within the required 30-day period has been a Class B misdemeanor for many, many years. And as we've found, it's never been a punishment that's been brought against a local law enforcement agency, because that would require the district attorney to bring those charges, and those two are typically collaborating on things. So I think, as different reporting has brought up this issue that, there are deaths that are not reported in this system, and there's no real way to compel a report. Right now, as the law is written, the Attorney General is the custodian of these reports, but doesn't really have any legal responsibility to ensuring that they're filed or making sure they're correct or anything like that. So the best that my organization, we do a lot of work with custodial death reports. I look at these all the time, and I find missing reports frequently and or errors in them. And basically all people like myself can do is appeal to the AG and say, hey, this is wrong. if you care, if you want to, please, get this changed. I also always reach out to the reporter, or the report writer, but they don't have to listen to me. So what 2901 would have done is change that Class B misdemeanor to like a system that would eventually lead to fines. It's a formula that was basically the same as one that was implemented for officer-involved shooting reports a few years ago. And it just changed the same type of punishment to a process where a reporter or anyone can, ask the AG, hey, this report is missing, and it triggers a set of processes on deadlines that could lead to fines. So it seemed like there was very little, if any, opposition from the law enforcement side to changing that requirement with the officer-involved shooting process. So I optimistically thought that would be a similar situation this year, especially with Josh's reporting on missing custodial death reports, and also especially during the coronavirus pandemic when the Texas Department of Criminal Justice was very far behind for many months on filing any custodial death reports of people who were dying in prison.
Yeah, the reporting you mentioned that also involved my colleague David Barrera from KXAN, who's in the audience today. It also involved a Central Texas family that we've come to know over years of coverage of this issue and related issues. Demisha Burns' 21-year-old son, Herman Titus, died in 2017 in the Travis County Jail. And his mother has had quite a difficult time finding out exactly what happened because of something called the dead suspect loophole that you may have heard about with the Texas Public Information Act. This is also an issue that has affected the Dyer family. Robert and Kathy Dyer, I understand, are watching on the live stream today from their home in Paris, Texas. This is an issue that also affected their son's case, Graham Dyer, who died after a violent encounter with Mesquite, Texas police a few years back, and they also had an extremely difficult time getting records and video in that case. Representative Moody, you filed legislation the last 3 sessions to close that loophole. Fill people in exactly what this loophole is, because it can kind of get in the weeds a little bit, but what were you aiming with your bill?
Sure, and I think it is also, it is important to continue to talk about what it is and why it's important to close it, because the default status, so start there, default status of our Public Information Act, and this probably seems laughable in the room that you all are sitting in, is that all the information belongs to us, the public. People who actually work in this arena realize quickly that may not be the case. We have created multiple exceptions to that, and there are good public policy reasons behind some, I would argue, and this one has been exploited. So the two that are used in conjunction are like, if there's an ongoing investigation, right, nothing can be, that's an available exclusion from public information. And then there's the back end, which says if you're not convicted or placed on deferred adjudication for something, then that would also preclude or allow an agency to preclude that information from being known to the public. So, and there's a good public policy reason behind that. I'm accused of something, I go through the investigation process and nothing comes of it. I've been dragged through the mud and all that, but it never amounts to anything, never convicted, never placed on deferred adjudication. Well, that information maybe shouldn't be out in public here to protect the accused, right? To protect the accused. Think about the policy perspective behind that. What started being used in the research that you've done and others have followed up on is they've seen that an uptick in the use of that in cases of in-custody death. So yes, by definition, if someone dies in custody, so like Mr. Dyer, no charges are ever brought, no conviction is had, no deferred adjudication is had because the individual is deceased. And so then they use that to mask it. In that case, you have the Dyer family. I'm glad they're joining us here, and I can't even, I've heard their story multiple times. I've met them a handful of times as they told their story, and it's heartbreaking. And it's one that no one should have to go through. But I mean, this is a family that 1 minute had their son that was having an episode that was in police custody, and the next minute they're told he's dead. And no reason, no anything. They said they couldn't, in fact, the reason they gave was they couldn't treat him because he was being too combative. The videos that they found showed an officer with standing with his foot on Graham's neck, tasing him in the general's several times. In fact, on the recording, you can hear someone say, "Motherfucker, I'm going to kill you." Right? That's the reality of what happened to Graham Dyer, and that's the reality that was masked by this exception to the Public Information Act. And so that's the kind of thing that should be inexcusable. And that is the information that we shouldn't allow people to mask behind this type of law. The law was not meant to protect law enforcement. It was meant to protect the accused. And so that is the importance of closing this loophole. We have to know what's happening in these situations. We are very well aware that the interaction with law enforcement and the public that they serve can look complicated at times, can look different than what we would experience on a day-to-day basis. But we need to know what it is. Just because the government thinks that something isn't pretty, or it looks bad, or is difficult for us to comprehend or understand what may have been going on, doesn't mean that they get to decide what we see or what we don't see. And so that's really what's at the crux of a bill like that.
That measure, unfortunately, failed this session, but it was part of a larger piece of legislation that would have gone beyond just that loophole. Specifically, the bill also aimed to create a public database for publicly released reports on use of force incidents, clarify existing law that a variety of force reports and officer vehicle accident reports are public information, make basic information about criminal investigations, including investigations into officer-involved shootings, public, and prevent sustained disciplinary records from being hidden in an officer's file. There were also some video-related points it sought to address as well. We'll get to those separately, but I know journalists were watching this one closely because it had so many facets that we deal with on a daily, weekly basis. Eva Ruth, why were those ideas so important?
Well, it's no news to anyone in this room that, state law really dictates what is releasable to the public, but you don't deal with everyone who has the same information all the time. So if you're a reporter making requests, it's still sort of the onus is on you to often educate the people who you are requesting records from, encourage them, inform them of what the law is, and often, if necessary, even fight your way, back when they file a letter requesting to withhold information with the Attorney General's office. Often writing your own letter to say why you need that information is the only thing that we can really do. Even though, even if the state law is on your side. So I think just having uniformity in that, the more uniformity, the better on the requester's end of things. I think that, the responsibility will still be on the requester to prove their case, but as far as officer discipline, there are a lot of inconsistencies depending on what kind of department you're dealing with. If the department is part of a civil service city, then there's a whole different set of records that you are not able to access under the Public Information Act. And so I think just having some consistencies in that, it seems like things are easier to hide in those cases. You aren't able to see a lot more on officer discipline, especially if they don't lead to a more severe outcome. So I think just reducing confusion and inconsistencies in those areas. I often have the luxury of being able to fight my case, taking the time to do that. If you're a beat reporter and you're needing information now, you might not have the effort or time to put into fighting those cases. So I think any more consistency would have been helpful.
Representative, I just have to ask kind of what happened in your opinion to why this bill failed. I know in the past, specifically with the dead suspect loophole, police unions have really challenged that legislation to the point where in a past session, the governor had threatened to veto a bill that included the dead suspect measure. Was that the case this time? Did you meet some challenges from police unions?
There were different constructs around this kind of different committees, different committee chairs. I mean, things change from session to session. This is why I've always been a proponent of trying to strike in. If you have momentum and can do something, you've got to take every opportunity to do it, which is why in prior sessions when we fought furiously to get this on to other bills, even as amendments, and we knew we have the votes on the floor. That's the thing that's frustrating, is we know we have the votes on the floor to get this done. We've shown it multiple times. So we can get this done and get it moving. Unfortunately, you get bottled up in committee. And I will say this, you've got, I think one of them went to state affairs. So let's also just acknowledge the fact that at the beginning of this session, we had Winter Storm Uri that completely upended state affairs. That dominated and took up all a significant amount of their time up front in the session. So there were other things. I mean, every session is different, and this one is very different. We did it in the midst of a pandemic with the winter storm that shut us down for a couple extra weeks at the beginning of the session, and everything just became very, very challenging to get moving. So those just situational problems, right? Just time problems that we have in a regular session compounded the problem of a hyper polarized conversation around policing, where we didn't seem to have the same alignment as we had in 2017 or 2019 around this particular issue. I certainly, still face opposition from police unions, but I mean, this is a bill, the more expanded bill, that didn't even get a hearing. So I mean, when I talk about taking steps back, and I don't want to be disheartened by that, and I don't want to discourage those in the room that support this type of legislation. Because like I said, the dynamic changed this session, the dynamic can change again next session. These are things that are important and will continue to be important. So it presents different challenges every time, and I think if I'm looking forward, the problem we're going to have in the next session is these are complicated issues, they're complex issues, and I don't want to say that seniority matters, but people that have been in the legislative process for a while might feel more comfort working on them, might have the opportunity to delve deeper into the policy. Next session, coming out of a redistricting session, is very likely we're going to have a large freshman class. So you're going to have a lot of brand new legislators who haven't really even touched a topic like this. So that may present just another situational, structural problem to moving a bill that's very complicated and complex.
Eva Ruth, in your view, what happened with that bill?
I think all of the things that obviously Representative Moody said, all the logistical challenges that were thrown at the session from every direction, I think coupled with, this very, complicated conversation, like policing in America has only become more complicated to talk about. It seemed like to some people, the death of George Floyd may have, been this turning point. There was a lot of hope, I think, nationally and in Texas also, that there was an interest in, more transparency of what police were doing, reforming the police department, and then coupled with like this big spike in homicides that we've seen across the country. Like policing has just become a more and more complicated subject, I think, for people to wrap their brains around, and making big changes to anything, I guess, it seems like just really isn't what the temperature is. But I think another thing that was challenging is just people's interpretations of what like criminal justice reform means. I mean, we saw some of that around like the idea of bail reform, and the language, there were multiple tracks that bill could have taken, and the way that it went was not necessarily an agreed upon reform of the bail system. So I think having this language used to mean different things is a tool that I think was manipulated and intentionally used that way in the session to complicate these issues even further.
Representative, was the bill trying to do too much? What was the thought in lumping so many issues into one piece of legislation? Do you think that that helped or hurt?
No, I mean, I think you always start with, well, not, I mean, tactics are different for every session, every bill. We had some success with standalone dead suspects loophole closure bill. The idea of this session was to this is not the only problem that we have here, and you did a good job of explaining some of the other things that are in that bill. But let's have that conversation. Let's open the door to that conversation, knowing that maybe you've got to pare back as you move forward. But we had already established a pretty clear consensus around closing the dead suspects loophole, at least in the House side of things. And so the idea is you should always be advancing the conversation. You should always be moving the conversation forward, and that was the goal of this session. The structural problems, along with kind of the political overlay on issues around policing, certainly did not allow us to advance that conversation. So we need to regroup and think about how to look at that going forward. Like I said before, we're going to have a number of retirements. You have the chairman of Homeland Security and Public Safety retiring, someone who has been has been a good partner for, quote unquote, criminal justice reform. Now, I guess I'll be careful not using, because it does get perverted and used for other purposes, so I want to be mindful of that. I will say meaningful, like what I would consider meaningful criminal justice reform. Chairman White has been involved in that, particularly on the decarceration side and re-entry side. He's looked a lot at that. He spent a lot of time in the corrections world. But serving as Homeland Security and Public Safety, we certainly had that committee was not built to pass any sort of policing reform. If you look at the membership of it and the politics of it. So that committee's going to see a shake-up next session, and that changes the opportunity there. So those are the things you have to continually look at the changing landscape and be ready to be nimble and pivot where you can. And I can't emphasize this enough, where you can get a piece. We had some body cam legislation to pass this session. It's never bad, and sometimes incrementalism has been used as a bad word in some circles, in advocacy circles. Sometimes that's all. You need to take the piece you can get. I learned from Barnett Coleman. He had the Sandra Bland Act in the initial session that it was 2017 when he had that, and many of the main components were taken out of it. There's still very good components left into it. And I remember talking to him after that, and he said, you always got to move it. Even if you can't get everything you want, move something across the finish line and build on it. So he built into that bill several data collection and reporting requirements. And those are things that we're using to this day now to advocate for further change. So those are the types of things you should always be thinking of. While you can't sometimes get the 100% of what you want across the finish line, get what you can and build on it. Because I'm temporary in this process, like every other legislator. I'm lucky to get to serve. I hope to be able to do it a little bit longer. But you want to make sure you have something for other people to build on and care about these issues. This is a system that needs change over time. You're never going to solve policing, right? That interaction and that friction between law enforcement and community service is going to exist forever. And so you're going to need people that are vigilant on that front at all times. So getting whatever piece you can at any time you can is important, and I can't stress that enough.
I mentioned the bill, your bill also focused on video. Specifically, it would have required the release of videos related to critical incidents like officer-involved shootings and deaths in custody within 60 days of the incident. We've seen this issue and criticism play out across the state with deaths in recent years. I just wonder, is that expecting too much from law enforcement, especially if investigations are still playing out? Specifically here in Austin police had that 60-day policy for the past year and had extreme challenges in actually meeting that timeline. Recently, they have even shortened that to 10 days, which the interim police chief, who's expected to become our permanent police chief soon, has said that will mean releasing videos that are not as redacted and may be very graphic. So there's a balance between transparency and that graphic nature. What are your thoughts on that, Representative?
We want to discuss timelines, that's fine, but the core concept is it needs to be public, right? So let's have the conversation about timelines sensitivity and all those things. But I'll go back. I always go back to the preamble to our Public Information Act, and the government is not going to decide what's good for us to know and what's not good for us to know. Some of this stuff is challenging, and it is objectively ugly and violent. But that's probably what makes it more important to know and to understand. It's not to sensationalize it. In fact, we took a step the other way. We don't want police running around with reality TV cameras, right? This is not about. So we've taken that same stance the other way. We're not here to sensationalize what's happening to people in police custody. We're here to get to the truth of it so that we can have better outcomes for law enforcement. Quite honestly, this would help them too, which is why I've never understood the resistance to it. Unless you're just trying to shield bad actors, which is the only thing I'm left with to understand, you're just trying to shield bad actors, then you should want this transparency too, because it makes things better and gives people more trust and allows for the relationship between law enforcement and the community they serve to be stronger, to be better. We talk about community policing, we talk about interaction with the public. All that's built on trust. When you're not disclosing information, how do you have a trusted relationship? How do you have a better relationship between law enforcement and their community? So that they're supposed to be a part of. So no, you want to talk about timing of it? That's fair. Considerations otherwise, I guess that's fair too. But this is ultimately, it needs to be public. It is information that belongs to the public, and it serves the greater good if it is public.
Eva Ruth, do you think it's expecting too much from law enforcement for that 60-day time frame if investigations are still playing out?
I think that that's a big umbrella that a lot of information is withheld under. A case is still under investigation and can be for a very long time. I think historically, it's taken a long time for us to get here. Texas was actually one of the first states that used dash cams in police vehicles back in the 1980s, and one of the ideas behind that was, to make officers who were patrolling in very rural areas safer. And then with the implementation of body-worn cameras with the 84th legislature, and the policies were very restrictive as to what could be released to the public. They were written in a way where there were lots of hurdles for requesters to jump through to make sure that they have all the information. There's actually a criminal penalty for officers who release body-worn camera footage erroneously or without the agency's permission. So I think that the idea of using those technology tools to watch our law enforcement is something that has taken law enforcement a lot to get used to. The technology is there, and we certainly use it on civilians. So I think, it is in the best interest of the public for this stuff to get out there and to be made public. I think that the open investigation caveat is just the biggest hurdle to the stuff getting out. And as far as the Austin Police Department's decisions, I think with the way that the state body-worn camera law is written, it just gives local departments a lot of wiggle room and room for interpretation of when things can be released. It's up to their discretion, basically. And there's some departments that I've seen, not in Texas, but Los Angeles PD, for example, that puts anything and everything on their YouTube channel. And I think that extreme is not necessarily that helpful either. Just having this giant bank of information that nobody's ever doing anything with, but having something in between where we have better access and we don't have to wait until, for years in some cases or ever, I think would be definitely helpful for us.
Representative, earlier you mentioned the other body cam legislation that did become law earlier this month. It specifically requires police to keep their body cameras recording during an entire investigation. How do you see that one playing out?
Yeah, going back to what I said before, it's I think it's an important piece of the puzzle. I think there were multiple other things we could have done to improve upon that. But I'll take it. I'll take it, and we'll see how that plays out over the course of the interim. And it'll give us an opportunity to see, it probably would give us the opportunity to understand where we can strengthen those laws even more. And so it's, like I said, these are, sometimes getting one piece at a time is okay. You can build upon it. It certainly left us wanting more. Obviously, I think that's a big theme around this conversation today. Is there was a lot left on the table, even I think as has been described as low-hanging fruit that probably should have been in any other session passed without much debate or discussion. And so that's where I think we start again and start afresh next time.
On that note, you've recently indicated that you are running again in 2022. Will you take up these transparency measures again? And if so, I know it's a little early, but what do you think you will do differently?
Yeah, I guess I did make that announcement. I hadn't gone through this third special or potential fourth special yet, so I'm going to reserve my right to change my mind at some point. See how much that teaches. No, I fully, if I'm given the opportunity to come back and serve, this is an arena that I think is critically important to work in. I have always been of the opinion, and it's probably cliche to say, that the most important work to do in the legislature is the most difficult work there is. So running up against, organizational opposition, structural opposition, that means you're doing the right thing. That means that you're in the right arena. If what you're doing is easy and doesn't take any effort or any struggle, then it's probably not worth it. So I'm up for that challenge, and I'll be watching some of the things that I talked about earlier. What does the committee composition look like? What are the background of those members that we've got? The unfortunate part is, rather than state affairs, the bills around policing and transparency and police interaction go to Homeland Security, Public Safety, criminal jurisprudence. You get some dealing with detention officers that go to corrections. These are three committees that usually house several junior members, and so there's going to be, you'll have some education to do, and that's part of what we do on a session by session basis. Let's sit down, let's meet with these new legislators, let's talk to them, see what their background is, see if they have an issue that's important to them to talk about, and that relates to some of these topics, and you take the lay of the land, and you go from there. So that's where the strategy starts. The bills, we know the policy, we know the reason to have the policy. We've got people that are, people like the Dyer family, who are always going to be strong advocates for change. And they're coming at it, in my opinion, from a place of care for others. They know what that felt like to go through that themselves, and they don't want that pain for other people. And so I think those are some things that never change in our approach. It is the reason why we're doing this, and the transparency, making sure that the public has access to this information so that we can have better outcomes for everybody. But it's going to, like I said, the landscape is going to change drastically. There's a lot of people that say the governor's running for president. If he remains governor, if he's reelected as governor, so does that change his approach to session? I don't know. In my entire time in the legislature, I have served under a governor that's running for president. It's always been very politically interesting. I was like, interesting, like that word. But definitely changes the dynamic every single time. And so those are just things you have to watch and wait. And I think the time that I spend in the legislature allows me to handicap those things, and also adjust and address for them, and address them as we move forward. So I look forward to the challenge, and it's one that I know a lot of people that are willing to step up and take on that challenge.
Sometimes with certain legislation, like the dead suspect loophole legislation, it can take several sessions before something actually passes. If you could address this answer, Representative, to those families you mentioned, like Robert and Kathy Dyer and Demisha Burns, what do you say about hope?
Boy, there are, like, I have not faced as dark a days as they have. I have young children of my own. I cannot even think about what that would feel like to have that in my world. So understanding that I don't know what that darkness feels like. I also know that if we're driven to do things better for other people, then that's what can keep our heart in this. That's what can keep hope in this. If it doesn't, if there's a way to make something positive from something so dark, then that's really where I find the hope. It's working in the world of criminal justice or corrections or anything where you have very complicated situations and very difficult outcomes for people. It can get disheartening. It can get you down. You see people that are railroaded in the system on a daily basis, and you see people that society throws away, that they treat as less than human. That can get very disheartening. But if you stick to the kind of a core concept that you see each other as human beings and treat each other with that dignity and love and respect, then I think we can rise above even the darkest of moments and provide a path forward where those things won't occur again. And that's the hope that I have, is that I know there is a better outcome, and the working in government hasn't beat all the idealism out of me quite yet, and that's why I decided to try and come back. Is you have to try and do the most good as you can do in the time that you have the opportunity to do it. And so I look forward to doing that, and I hope that those families who have been through those dark moments, I pray for them. I care about them a lot, even if I don't know them personally, because I don't want them to be forgotten in this process. And when we do get there, when we get across the finish line, it's going to be because of the work they've done, the time they've spent, the stories they've shared, and them willing to open up their hearts and letting people know what that felt like to go through.
We've talked a lot about what needs to happen in the future, but what we're experiencing in the present and in the recent past have been even more challenging because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Beyond the slowdown for some agencies in responding to public information requests, one thing, Eva Ruth, that you have experienced is the inconsistent reporting of COVID cases and deaths in general behind bars during this time. Both TDCJ and the Commission on Jail Standards have changed how they're reporting and what they make publicly available, and that's really challenging for watchdogs to follow the impact in jails and prisons.
Yes, it is. It has been an interesting, year and a half. So the Texas Justice Initiative does a lot of our work using data that we get from open records requests to the government. We collect data on custodial deaths, officer-involved shootings, and things like that. And we also, starting in last spring, COVID became a thing, started to see different agencies posting information in different ways. And so as a team, I lead a team of volunteers of people who build our site and are data scientists and really intelligent people. And we decided to create a couple of maps. One that would show the deaths of people by COVID who are in incarceration facilities, federal, state, county, all those levels. And then also another map that shows deaths by COVID of people who work for law enforcement agencies. And we wanted to be able to show this over time and keep this data alive so that we could show the spread of COVID and sort of how these facilities and departments were being affected. So that looks like every night me going through a lot of a lot of work to find people who have died of COVID, unfortunately. So I combed through a bunch of websites, including TDCJ, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the Texas Commission on Jail Standards, things like the Officer Down Memorial page, media reports, and also our custodial death reporting database. So each of those has been a sort of a different animal throughout the pandemic, just regarding the, and also the Bureau of Prisons provides news releases when somebody dies in their custody as well. So TDCJ, as the federal or the statewide prison oversight organization, initially they were posting, little announcements every time somebody died, a short paragraph about who the person was, where they had been, how long they had been sick, what their conviction was. And they were also posting longer announcements on staff members who died. There was a report that came out by some University of Texas academics and other researchers, and I think it was in December, and those announcements stopped for the most part, and since then have been fairly sporadic, if at all. Like most of the deaths of incarcerated people who TDCJ has announced this year actually took place in 2020. So they're lagging pretty far behind. And those announcements did not often match up with the custodial death reports. So there were just inconsistencies within this one agency. Then when we looked at the Texas Commission on Jail Standards, which are responsible for overseeing our county jails, they were for many months requiring jails to submit a report every day when they had an infection among staff or incarcerated individuals. And they actually stopped doing that in June of this year. So while the Delta variant has surged through the state of Texas, we have had zero data since I think June 18th is the last date that I had. From TCJS, and that was a policy change from TCJS's perspective, that they're, we're done with this thing, we're done tracking this thing. So sort of the standard, regardless of what these agencies have been doing, they have been still following state law to most of the time, and reporting their deaths via custodial death report. For several months with TDCJ, that didn't happen because they had staff member issues and it was falling through the cracks. But for the most part, those reports exist. However, those have also been changing. Initially, a report might list a cause of death as pending, and that may or may not ever get updated. If it does get updated, it might say something like bronchopneumonia or, heart failure, which are kind of vague explanations of someone's death. There is a summary section where people might go into more detail, but for the most part, it's a two-sentence, if it's from a prisoner death, it's a two-sentence summary, if anything. So, yeah, tracking these deaths has been sort of holding sand, but I think that it'll be a couple of years still until we actually know the total impact of the coronavirus on our incarceration facilities in Texas, unfortunately. But I can tell you that we'll continue to track this information and keep updating our maps as long as we can and as long as COVID is a thing.
We appreciate that from you and your organization. Those late nights are not fun, but necessary. I do want to open up some questions from our audience here in person. If you have any questions, go ahead and stand up, speak up loud, because I'm going to have to repeat your question over the microphone because we want all of our people that are watching our live stream to be able to hear it. So throw them at us. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jeff Morgan, and I really appreciate what you're talking about with transparency and how transparency creates trust and so on. And Representative Moody, I liked a lot of what you said too, but I wanted to know about expanding the area of transparency, because I've gone into some of these courts, and the injustices that I have seen in the courts have been awful. And we don't talk about them, and the courts try to keep us out from watching them. Yet in our Texas Constitution, it says the courts shall remain open. So is that something that you also would be interested in bringing forward in an upcoming session, talking about transparency of the judiciary as well as transparency within law enforcement and people that are incarcerated? Thank you.
Representative, let me repeat that for our viewers that are watching on live stream. Briefly, Representative, the question was, what do you see as something to do with transparency for the court system? I know as a former prosecutor, you've seen this firsthand, so is there anything we can do to make our courts more open?
So I think so. I mean, there's a lot that we can do. So great question. And there was a time that I dabbled with the idea of running for district attorney here in El Paso. It probably was no big secret, but had I gone down that path, one of the things I thought about doing, and there are people that are experts out there in you know, and we've heard a little bit about it in data visualization. So understanding what's going on is part of us doing better and demanding better. But for anyone that doesn't go in the courthouse, if you're not a lawyer or you're not someone who's being represented, I mean, what do you know about what it looks like? And you'll hear what floor you get on. We have 12 floors of the courthouse here in El Paso. What floor you get off on, what court you walk into, determines, a lot of times determines what the outcome can be for you. Whether you have appointed counsel or hired counsel, what your age is, what your what ethnicity you are. I'd love to see those comparisons made public and forward-facing, right? We have the data, we know the outcome, right? OCA, Office of Court Administration, has all those outcome data. We have arrest data from DPS. We have an enormous amount of data, but we need to make that consumable for the public at large, because unless they're going in and out of the courthouse every day, it's why judicial elections are so important. And for the most part, people don't have a broad education about the judges that they're electing. And more data is better for people to understand what's happening. So if you're a 17-year-old black kid walking into a courtroom on the 5th floor versus 7th floor for a low-level felony drug offense, what's the outcome? Who's the prosecutor in that court? What's their experience level? Did you get a court-appointed lawyer? Did you get a hired counsel? What is it? How does all that stuff impact how you exit the system? And all those things should be forward-facing. And we shouldn't be afraid of it. Sometimes, there may be bias in the system that we're not recognizing, or that someone doesn't recognize is happening in their very courtroom. And let's if we put that out there, we're not afraid of confronting it, and we'll have better outcomes and we'll have fairer outcomes. So I'm all for it. We have the data. We have an enormous amount of data that we collect. Turning it around and making it consumable is really the challenge. I've seen other states delve into this. But it's going to get uncomfortable for some folks when they realize that maybe there's they may not see it that way. And so exposing those uncomfortable truths is probably an important part of this process, and I'm all for it. The mechanics of getting it done probably would be the challenge. The funding to get it done would be the challenge, but having that information in consumable ways available to the public will make people more accountable. And it'll probably make the system fairer. I'm all for it. I think that's a great point.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I didn't know I was going to get that opportunity.
I'm a journalist, of course.
Thank you so much. So Representative Moody talked about at one time wanting to run for district attorney, and Eva, you mentioned district attorneys. And from what I understood you saying, it appeared from what you were saying is that district attorneys are not always forthcoming. District attorneys may hide certain truths that may be uncomfortable. Is that a widespread problem of district attorney corruption or hiding of information?
So the question, so we can get it for our viewers on the live stream, is there a widespread problem with corruption and hiding information on the part of district attorneys in Texas?
I will just clarify that the point that I was making was slightly different. It was that I would not expect, in many cases, a local district attorney to bring charges against their local law enforcement, who they frequently partner with on investigations, if there is a missing custodial death report. That just doesn't seem like a likely scenario in my opinion. But as far as widespread corruption and district attorneys hiding information, I think there's a case-by-case basis there that they're elected and they can run on transparency or not, and I think that that's not really my wheelhouse.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you so much. There was an issue that I wanted to talk about with and I won't mention it right now, just mention it, throw it out there, but there's a lot of times district attorneys are, like interference with child custody issues. They don't prosecute that, and yet it is a state jail felony in Texas, and I wonder why that's the case, that they don't even look at it in many instances.
Sounds like a panel for next year, Kelly. Other questions? Yes.
Eva Ruth, I'm David Montgomery, and first of all, kudos to all the work you do in your database and Texas Justice Initiative and all of that. I was interested in what you just said about the COVID records in the prison system. And is there any further explanation on why they're kind of stonewalling and
When it comes to the COVID numbers?
right, and because I got the idea, I've done some research on that earlier, and they seem to be pretty accessible, but it seems like they're curtailing that, and I'm just wondering why.
So the question for our viewers on the live stream was, is there any other information you could share, Eva Ruth, about the stonewalled COVID records when it comes to jails and prisons?
Yeah,
And Stonewall might be too harsh, so maybe not.
right. I think that the changing ways that they have been reporting these numbers is, something that has stood out to me just as a journalist and as somebody who watches data and is looking at these numbers. I don't have an explanation. I asked, TCJS when I noticed that the data was no longer coming in June, why that was happening. And their response was that they told jails that this is no longer required. And that there was no more explanation of that. I mean, I think there was also a mentality back in June, it's hard to think back to that point, but that, there were vaccines readily available, we were sort of past COVID. I don't think that the CDC would have recommended, stopping these counts at that point, but I don't know. I know that, TDCJ also has, their personnel, their people who are involved in making those decisions. There was somebody who was responsible for filing those custodial death reports that weren't getting filed for many months. And, when I reached out and started to ask questions about it, that was fixed, but it took a few months for all these reports to start coming in. So you sort of see these bottlenecks in different parts of the process, like if you look at the past year and a half. And I mean, now I know that TDCJ has continued making these announcements when there is a staff member who dies of the coronavirus, but still isn't making those announcements on incarcerated individuals. And I'm not sure why they're doing that. I just, I feel like it's important to stay on top of the changing landscape of how they are reporting this information.
Anything you wanted to?
I was just wondering, are there advocacy groups like maybe the Texas Inmate Families Association who are trying to do some watchdog?
Are there advocacy groups trying to watchdog the same topic?
As on the prison side, there may be. I have not heard of that. I know on the TCJS side that Texas Justice Initiative is one of several organizations that is signing on to a letter to ask them to start making those counts public again every day. They weren't perfect by any means. I mean, there were lots of jails that were not reporting cases when they should have been. And even if they do restart, we'll miss, July, August, September, those were deadly months in Texas. So I think I still have a concern of, a gap, but I do hope that we can apply pressure, with a coalition of groups to try to bring these counts back, at least on the jail side.
All right, thank you. All right, we've covered a lot. Quick final words from you, Eva Ruth. Thoughts on this topic in general?
It's great to see everyone in person, and thanks for this lively discussion and for all the work that you guys do, Representative Moody and Josh. And if anyone has questions about criminal justice data, I'm always willing to answer them. And I'd also just pitch our website, Texas Justice Initiative. We have lots of data that we would love for you to use in your reporting and lawyering and everyday lives.
Yes, I can vouch for that. David and I have used your data many times in all of this reporting we've been doing. Thank you very much. Representative Moody, final thoughts?
I'm certainly grateful to be a part of this conversation. This is not, working in the dead suspects loophole bill was certainly not a brainchild of mine, but once we discovered and through great reporting, discovered the real problem that was going on in Texas, we couldn't help but get involved in this. It's the right thing to do. And so, it is always challenging to go through these changes in law. But we're making real advances in educating people about the problems that exist and lack of transparency in these arenas. And so, thank you for the job that you all do, for your passion, because you run into walls on a daily basis. I run into different ones, but you all run into walls on a daily basis. The fact that you all are able to and willing to push through them gives people like me the ability to do my job better. And so I just want to say thank you to everybody.
All right. Thank you both for being with us, and thank you for listening to us speak and answer questions. And at this time, before we take our break, I'll turn it back to FOIFT's president up with the next portion of our program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Arif Punji again, president of the board of the FOI Foundation of Texas. And I'm honored to be able to honor the recipients of this year's Spirit of FOI Awards. And I just want to make a quick announcement before we get going. And that is an announcement about a new scholarship that we have, the Joel White Scholarship. It's named after a longtime board member and a former president of the FOI Foundation who passed away in 2018, Joel White. And Joel contributed his time and his talent to the cause of transparency and open government and to the FOI Foundation, and was a champion of the First Amendment as well. And the inaugural Joel White Scholarship will be awarded to a student attending law school in Texas during the 2022-2023 academic year, and will announce the recipient in early 2022. If you know anyone that is interested in transparency and the First Amendment and who is in law school or headed to law school, I encourage you to direct them to foift.org, and the details will be there on applying for the scholarship. And if you're interested in donating to the scholarship fund, we'd love that too. And you can do that also at the website, foift.org. So now on to the Nancy Monson Spirit of FOI Awards. I love these awards every year because it really reflects the hard work that many of you do out day to day. And there's two categories of awards. The distinction between both simply is the news market and the population of that news market. So the Class A category for news markets with a population of under 500,000 people, this year's award goes to the Odessa American for its persistent reporting and legal fights in the courts of law to hold city government accountable in releasing law enforcement records. And I'll share a short part of the quote from one of the judges while I think we have someone from Odessa American that's going to come receive the award, makes his way up. Quote, "With this persistent pressure and with the public's right to know at the forefront, the Odessa American, through its reporting and through the courts, has been relentless in its efforts to fight police secrecy and to inform residents about crimes in their community. The paper's incremental reporting of its work to obtain routine crime information and its reporting of the city's disregard for open records laws illustrates to readers the importance of transparency, the importance of the laws we rely on to do this type of reporting, and explaining why it matters." Congratulations to the Odessa American. As the paper's publisher, Patrick Canty, said in one of the articles, quote, "We will never tire of fighting to uphold laws in place to ensure the free flow of public information to the citizenry and to the news media. It's a cornerstone of a free and civil society." Well said. Congratulations. That takes us to the Class AA category, and this is for news markets of 500,000 or more people. And this year's award goes to KXAN here in Austin for its report, Dead and Undone. The judge said that all the entries here were strong and spending time with them was invigorating. But I'll share a quick quote while Josh and perhaps other of his colleagues make their way up. Said about this report, quote, "By shining a light on a law that's supposed to provide answers to families and the public, KXAN exposes shortcomings and an obscure loophole, which we heard about today, about deaths in police custody and why they go unchecked. Dead and Undone shows how the gears of this transparency law are supposed to work, and it shows the real-life implications, heartbreak and anguish when a system of transparency fails and when the government denies the records that the public is entitled to." Congratulations to KXAN. Big congratulations to these winners and to all the journalists who entered. Your work helps to hold the government accountable. It reminds folks in the court of public opinion why transparency, why public information, why open meetings laws matter, and what it's all about. And now we'll take a break until around 10:30 and then go right into our legislative panel after that time. Short break.